Mi lamento e mi rischiara chi mi insegna a farmi amar. Chi mi insegna a farmi amar.
All right, good morning, everyone. Can you all hear me? It's great to be here and to share the stage with so many of our existing partners, from the RSC to the Philharmonia Orchestra to Meow Wolf and many others. So before we get started, how many of you are familiar with Magic Leap and the concept of spatial computing? Okay, great, a fair amount. So my name is Kathy Wang, and I help lead Magic Leap's business development team across all of our strategic content partnerships with a focus on consumer-facing experiences. So whether those are on-device content pieces or location-based experiences. And so I thought it would be helpful to frame our conversation today around 4 key questions, right? And the first is really around what exactly is spatial computing? I think there's been a lot of terms that have been thrown around in the industry, so I think it's important for our conversation just to set a common framework for how we think about the concept. And then I want to spend a little bit of time sharing with you guys some of the experiences that we've done in-house as well as with our strategic partners to really inspire you to think about what are all these different ways that whether you are a creative director or a producer or a developer or a designer or architect or business leader, right? And in all of those different fields, there's so many ways for you to think about incorporating spatial computing, whether from a consumer-facing angle or from an enterprise internal organizational angle, to think about incorporating spatial computing into storytelling and into creating a better way to engage with your audiences. And then I'll spend just a few minutes on why I think it's important to be doing this and to be doing this now while the technology is still in its early stages of being developed. And then I'll just wrap with a couple of best practices on what we've seen work really well for some of our partners. So let's set the stage, if you will. What exactly is spatial computing? So for those of you who haven't had a chance to experience Magic Leap yet, I wanted to share just a brief clip of some of the experiences that are available on our platform. So that's just a handful of some of the experiences that are available on device, and it doesn't include some of the more elaborate experiences that are available at certain location-based experiences. But I think it helps set the stage for what we mean when we talk about spatial computing, right? And it's really about the combination of computer vision and AI and a lot of other things to create something in which you can render digital content in your real world as if it were real content that observes the physics of the real world. And so when we think about computer vision, I think the best analogy is really thinking about a self-driving car, right? And so if you think about what needs to happen in order to allow that car to drive down the street, it has to first of all be environmentally aware of everything around it. So it has to know where the sidewalks are, where the other cars are, where the pedestrians are walking in real time so that it can then navigate the street. And it has to understand where the car itself is relative to all of that that's going on around it. And so if you think about spatial computing, right, when you put on the device, the platform similarly recognizes everything that's around it through environmental mapping. So it understands where the surfaces are, where all the floors are, where you have furniture in your space, where there's humans walking around. And then it also understands where the user is relative to all of that so that it can then seamlessly render this digital content in the real world. So that if I were, for example, to put a digital apple or something like that on the edge of this stage, right, right, it would understand that, okay, the apple would need to fall off the stage because you understand where the edge of the stage is, and you understand that the apple is supposed to have gravitational pull, like in real-world physics, and so it would fall off the stage. The AI component is really about allowing the platform over time to understand your behaviors and your preferences and your biometrics and a lot of other info about the user and how it's using it in relative to its entire environment, so that it evolves into a platform that is very personalized, right? And that is very customized to you as a user, as opposed to a platform that is meant for, that you can share necessarily across all different users. It's one that creates a very personalized experience. And so, as opposed to VR, in which you are completely transported to a different environment, right? And it completely blocks out your real world. When we talk about AR, a lot of times, I think the connotation is that it's this, it's a flat overlay, essentially, of digital content onto your real world. So spatial computing really takes that one step further, and it allows for digital content in your space that can actually interact with the real environment around you. And so that's where the real power of the platform is. And when you think about attributes of spatial computing, we like to think about it in the framework of these 7 attributes, and I'll cover a lot of these through the course of the presentation. But a lot of it is really all building up to something that we call the magic verse. And I'll cover this in a little bit more detail later as well, but you can essentially think about it as a digital twin to your physical world. So I want to share a little bit just about some of the experiences that we've seen both through in-house experimentation as well as work with our partners on how you can start to incorporate elements of spatial computing. And I think at the end of the day, right, it's really, really important to still think about it as what are the experiences that you're trying to enable for your audience and for your guests. Because I think the whole point of any technology is really to allow your audience and your guests to connect more deeply to the stories you're trying to tell, and then in the best cases, to try to connect with one another, right? And that can happen both in venue at a specific, location or a theater or a museum. That can happen before their visit to get them excited. That can happen post-visit to allow them to, continue the conversation going with you as an institution and to allow them to be inspired to share their stories and their experiences with those in their community. So the first thing that I would encourage you all to think about is around leveraging space and scale. And so we live in a 3-dimensional world, not a 2D screen. But I think when you think about digitizing the performing arts, the sense of space is often the first thing that you lose, right? When you try to take a stage performance and bring it to a TV screen or a mobile phone, right? You really can't have this sense of 3-dimensionality and the physicality of all the actors or all the museum pieces. And so how can you really use spatial computing to allow you to break out of that 2D box, right? And so there's a lot of different ways to do this. I think one of the most impactful and simplest is just to play around with scale. And so you can scale things up to life size or even larger than life, or you can scale things down to a miniaturized version, and that creates a very different perspective for your audience to really be engaging with the content. So I'll share one example of each. The first, in terms of scaling something into life size, this is a partnership that we did with HBO's Game of Thrones series, which just concluded, and it's a location-based experience at AT&T stores in the US. So I'll play for you this clip.
There is only one war that matters. The Great War. And it is here.
So think about how much more powerful that experience is, right? Because it takes something that you're normally so used to watching on your phone or on your TV or on your laptop, and it takes it into a completely different immersive portal where you can actually engage with some of these characters. The second experience that I want to share is a visual from our partnership with the RSC. This is from 7 Ages of Man, and I think what is such a great experience about this is that it takes something where, it's something that's so well loved and well recognized by unify everyone, right? It takes the stories of Shakespeare and it completely flips it on its head by turning it into an experience that, normally you're thinking about engaging with a play in a certain way, and we all have this preconceived notion of what it means to go and see a play. But this turns something like that into a completely miniaturized version. And so what we did here was we partnered with the RSC to create a volumetric capture of Rob Gilbert, who's the actor who you see here, and then we integrated digital content into that. So this tree and this setting, and as Rob goes through the monologue of Seven Ages of Man from As You Like It, the digital tree evolves and breathes and grows and dies according to what is happening in the monologue. And this whole experience is happening on your tabletop, or it can happen on any table, but it's a very, very intimate environment, and you can really get up close to the actors and you can walk around it and you can hear where the audio is coming from. And so it takes something that's a very large scale, life-size experience and then miniaturizes that into a very intimate experience for the user. So the next big area that I think is important to keep in mind is the sense of integrating the physical and the digital, right? A lot of the magic of why we go to experience things like plays and museums is because of the physical elements, whether it's the set or the stage or the props or a lot of the actual physical collection items in a museum. And so what we find with a lot of content creators, especially those that are really good, who can actually create very great digital content, is that you end up almost having all virtual content, right? And that kind of, then you kind of lose the whole point of this platform, which is allowing you to have both this digital element and the physical element. And so the example that I want to share from here is one that was done by Warp and Media, which is a agency who has been one of our closest partners based out in Stockholm. And they work closely with H&M across a lot of their projects. And this was something that they did last fall for H&M's collaboration with Moschino. And this was something they showcased in New York.
Who is she?
It's Moschino. So this is a very trippy experience, but and this is obviously very commerce and retail related, but I think it can easily translate to something like a museum setting, right? And right now they're actually working with H&M on a print studio project in which you can use a Magic Leap device and design your own t-shirt print and then get that printed for you physically, like your actual t-shirt on the spot. So really playing around with how do you combine these digital elements and physical elements. So the third big area is around new interaction modalities. And what I mean by this is, I think every couple of decades, there's a new computing interface that comes around that allows creators to explore new ways of interactivity and interacting with content and building that into their, into the experiences that they're creating. Just as how with, when we're switching from analog music to digital music, or when you're thinking about the shifts from film to television, what it means to create content in each new computing medium is very, very different. And so I think keeping in mind all of these different ways that we engage with content, right? The way that we humans engage with one another and with the world around us is not through swiping or pinching in to zoom in, or pinching out to zoom out. It's with things like eye contact and using your voice and using your hands and using gestures. And spatial computing allows you to bring all that back into the experiences. And so especially when you start thinking about combining some of these together, right, you can do things like track exactly where someone's eyes are looking, or where their head is moving, or where their hands are moving. And when you start to combine a lot of these together into what we call multimodal experiences, that's where a lot of times it becomes really, really interesting, and you're creating an experience that is really immersive precisely because it feels very natural. And so a lot of our partners have dived pretty deep on specific modalities, and so I wanted to share two different ones. The first is one that was done in partnership with Sigur Rós, the Icelandic band, and this really explores gesture in depth and gesture as a way to evoke new landscapes and create new content. So this is a really magical way where you're not using the controller at all, right? All you're using are your hands, and you're in there and you're, moving them around, and it's a very kind of different experience than most people are used to, and usually takes people a little bit of time to get into it, but once they do, it just feels like you're, really engulfed in this world. The next experience that I want to share is also on the music area, and it's a related but very different way of using your environment as an input mechanism. So this is a partnership that we did with Sennheiser, and it allows you to use everyday objects in your space, ordinary found objects in your space, to create music. I'm going to pause it just so you get an idea of it, but I think that's such a neat way, right? It's such a simple and neat idea, and it allows you to just use everything that's in your space and really use this physicality aspect and then create something on top of it. And I think I chose, two music experiences here because, like we talked about yesterday and today, and a lot of the presenters have shared, having sound and audio be a core component of what it is you're creating is so important. And we always say that something really has to sound real in order to look real, and I think it's absolutely true. So I would encourage you all to think about how you can incorporate sound and audio and spatial audio into your experiences. The fourth aspect is thinking about how you can use spatial computing to establish a sense of presence. And I think this is probably one of the hardest but most important things to do using technology, and it's something that tech hasn't really done a good job of to date, which is making it feel like you're actually standing across from someone, right? And really feeling like they're there and you can make eye contact with them. And as high quality as a Skype conversation is or something like that, it's just not the same as having someone there in front of you. And so how do you think about using that and establishing this sense of presence? There's a lot of ways to do this as well, and I'll just share two of them. This is an experience that happened at the Serpentine Galleries in London, and it was a partnership with Marina Abramovich, in which she was volumetrically captured, and then she was presented in the center of this museum space, and the guests and visitors could observe her and her movements, just in the same way that if she were there in person, which she has done for other museum exhibitions, but it's a very interesting twist on that. The second bit that I'll share is something that some of you may be familiar with. This is our human-centered, AI-driven character called Micah, and this is something that our team has been working on for a very, very long time, beyond even just the technical challenges, right? The philosophical and ethical challenges and questions around what does it actually mean to engage with another human being, right, who is not a real human being. That's something that we're all still thinking through, and we want to be very thoughtful about. But I think this will give you a good idea of something that we showcased recently at Game Developers Conference, GDC, and it's an experience in which the visitor can collaborate together with Micah to create this visual collage. So this goes on for a bit longer, but I'll just pause it there. I think it's an experience where you really feel like she's sitting across from you, right? And if any of you ever have the chance to try this, as we showcase it at other locations, it's quite a powerful and moving experience. The last big area, and I think this will resonate with a lot of you, is how do you think about, some of these experiences work really well one-on-one and you want that intimacy, but other experiences, you really want this sense of having a shared collective experience. And that's why we frequently go to plays and go to, museums, because we want to participate in this very social, inclusive activity together. And so this is just a rendering, but it gives you a sense of some of the larger scale things you can begin to do in a shared collective space while still having a sort of personalized element for each person, right? And I think something like this is especially relevant when you think about areas like education, where you really need that group learning experience. And so one of the partnerships that we're working on right now with one of the leading museum institutions is allowing for a curator or a teacher to present a digitized sculpture or artifact to a group of students or visitors, some of whom are physically present in the same room and in the space, and then some of whom are remotely co-present. So it really takes this concept of learning and wide-scale learning to a whole new level. So 5 key things that I think really easy to start doing and start experimenting with. So shifting gears a little bit, in terms of the business side of things, right, I think it's really important to start thinking about a lot of these concepts now. And there's a couple of different reasons. I would say, first and foremost, this is nothing new, right? You really want to think about how you can use this to gain brand exposure, gain a better engagement with your audience. And I think especially as you think about the short window of opportunity that you really have to be the first in an emerging new field and new category, right? Before the saturation of things like the mobile app store, like Peter had mentioned earlier, right? How many new apps are being published to the App Store every day, and it's so hard to distinguish yourself, versus now you really have this chance to be a first mover and to be positioned as an innovator, and to have your audiences view that as well. The second big area is really around setting the standard for your industry. And I think, thinking about the first and the second together, with any new computing platform, there's a way to attract new audiences and new demographics, right? And I think there's a way to, today, attract that group of people who are growing up to be spatial computing natives. Just like how, the last generation was growing up to be mobile native, there's that same opportunity that's available. And I think in terms of establishing the standard, spatial computing, we view it as really becoming the next computing platform. And I think the telco carriers today are laying the physical infrastructure and groundwork for that through 5G. And so it's important to start iterating and learning what works and learning what doesn't. And I think even beyond that, for a lot of our early partners, this is really a way to work hand in hand with us or with any platform as a platform company, and to help shape that roadmap, right? We really take all of the feedback that our early partners give us very seriously, and we consider what are the priorities that are most important to them, what are the features that are most important, what are things that are maybe not as important for their specific field, because no one really knows necessarily the right way to build all of this, right? And so it's very much this iterative process with our partners, and I think getting in early gives you the opportunity to start shaping the product roadmap and to start shaping the platforms that you're actually going to be building on for the coming decades. And the last big area is certainly around revenue opportunities and revenue streams, right? I think whether that's through engaging new customer demographics, like we just talked about, or new experiences, because people are still very much willing to pay for novel new experiences, or through new distribution channels. So if you're primarily engaging with your audience today through an at-venue experience, or through a theater, or through a museum experience, is there a way to create a at-home component, or maybe an in-classroom component, or a pop-up location-based experience component, right? Because the platform itself, the spatial computing platform, allows you the flexibility and the quality, honestly, to be able to think about some of these other distribution channels more seriously. So even if you're just thinking about an at-venue experience, the number of different things that you can do to enhance what that experience is from today is pretty broad, right? So there's a lot of unused space, for example, at any theater or at any concert venue. And so how can you think about using, empty corridors or empty hallways and start integrating ways for you to engage with, with your audience more broadly through fan engagement or concessions or navigation or a host of other different things. And all of that really makes sense when you think about what you're doing, which is ultimately today, you're bringing people to places, right? And there's a very constrained set of opportunities when you think about doing that. But when you're able to then bring places to people, that certainly opens up the pie and creates what we call the amplified economy. We didn't spend too much time on the enterprise side of things, but just really quickly, I want to make sure that we spend a few minutes on this. And this is an example of a new building construction, but I think this can be applied to a number of different things, from theater pre-visualization to building out a new exhibition at a museum. And so how can you think about using things like environmental mapping and digital co-presence, right? This is a real estate agent, but this can easily be a director or an actor. And think about better understanding how new content in your space or new objects in the space may look like before it's there, and how it may interact with the rest of that environment once it's there. So three big reasons why it's pretty important to start thinking about this now. And finally, a few best practices on how to actually start doing this. I think a easy way to think about it is just evaluating it through this framework of desirability and feasibility. And this is not unique to spatial computing, but I think it's especially important when we think about spatial computing, because on the desirability front, right, there's so many different ways, like we just talked about, that you can start playing around and start experimenting with this. So really focusing on what are the key metrics that you're trying to move for your organization or for the experience or for your audience. And then on the feasibility front, right, some of these experiences sometimes are very resource intensive to create and may take time and may take, may be expensive. And so one approach that we've found to work well with a lot of our early partners is something we call crawl, walk, run. And it's very simple. It's really about starting with a creative or a technical hypotheses and a very specific one or a very specific pain point that your customers or audience members may have. And then, building out a simple proof of concept before building out a much more robust roadmap to a full experience. And that allows you to, not only hedge your resource allocations earlier on, but it's also a way for you to grow into the technology, right? I think the tech is moving so quickly today that what is impossible today may very well be possible in 9 months. And so you really want to afford yourself this flexibility to grow into the technology over time. And I think that's all I had. So hope that was helpful. Hope that it helped to inspire some ideas. My colleague, Callie, is also here somewhere in the audience, and she and I will be around today. We'll try to do a couple more informal demos during lunchtime. So if you haven't had a chance to check out Magic Leap, or if you have questions, please come find us.